Hello, EDCI 572. This is Andy Sullivan, and today I'm going to talk to you about technical training using simulations or serious games. I'm the process plant technology instructor at City College, where we teach people how to be refinery operators. And one of the neat things about being a refinery operator is that you get to work with large, expensive, and potentially hazardous equipment. A unique thing with this equipment and this job is that the equipment runs 24/7 for long periods of time, sometimes as long as 6 years in a row without ever stopping. And so the challenge is, how do you train individuals to run equipment when it's always in service? And anytime you mess with it or play with it or make adjustments to it, you run the risk of shutting it down or damaging it or upsetting an apple cart and costing your company a lot of money. And so there's the challenge: how to train people on complex tasks when they can't necessarily work on the equipment. I think simulations have an enormous potential to help us out there. And I'm not the first one to see this, and there are simulation tools out there. But in my opinion, there's opportunity to go to the second level, where you immerse an individual in a task that they're working on, and they can become skilled at that task in a safe environment, free from downside, free from consequences for error, until they acquire a mastery level on those tasks. And then when they're out in the field and it's the middle of the night and it's cold and there's not a lot of people around and they need to exercise this task, there's confidence that they know how to do the task because it's been rehearsed in a safe environment, and they're well prepared to do the task safely and reliably, without any lifelines, when the time is right. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a project that I've started. It's a big project. We've made pretty good progress on it, but there's still room to go. And the core of what I'm going to get at is, what is the right tool to help us build that simulation? I'm going to break this video down into three pieces, three bite-sized pieces. One is I'm going to talk to you about what I've built in one tool called GameMaker. And then I'm going to talk to you about another small project that I made in a different tool called Game Blocks. And then in the third video, what I'll do is I'll compare the two, so that an individual who might be interested in making their own simulation or serious game or training type game is in a position to make a good decision about what tool might be most valuable for them. So to get started, let's talk about the tool that I've made here. What I have is I have a simulation, and I'll try to keep my picture up there to give you something to look at besides a bland old PowerPoint. But what I made is I made a simulation tool that helps an operator bypass a control valve. A control valve is nothing more than a fancy valve that controls a flow in a process plant or a refinery or chemical plant. But it's sophisticated because control valves don't run forever. They break and they leak, and so they need to be maintained. And they need to be maintained on a cycle that isn't necessarily the same cycle as the operating cycle, such as 6 years for some refinery equipment. So you need to take it out of service. There's many control valves, and there are many control valves in a refinery, and so it's a task that's done periodically, and it has to be done right. And if you don't do it right, you run the risk of upsetting the apple cart, maybe even shutting down a unit. Some of these units are very expensive to lose operations on the order of $250,000 a day is not abnormal. Here's a neat image of industrial control valve. I have the site that I borrowed it from, cited down at the bottom. And what you have is essentially a pipe coming down on one side and it goes back up on the other. The control valve is actually the green valve in the middle. It uses air to open and close. There's a block valve on the left and a block valve on the right. Those essentially stop flow. And then there's a globe valve at the top that can replace the functionality of the globe valve. And so if you block the valve on the left, flow stops, but you could reestablish it and control it with the valve on the top. Interesting. The challenge is that some units in a refinery shut down on low flow or high flow, and so you need to be able to take the green valve out of service when it's not working properly while maintaining a steady, constant flow. That's not so easy. Um, Here's an industrial version of a valve, and so you can see it looks just like the computer version that I showed you on the last page. And it has a control valve. In this case, it's gold. It has a block valve to the immediate left and right of it, and then it has a globe valve immediately above it. And so very similar to the one I just showed. I had process plant students build a similar version in the process plant lab this semester, and here's what we built. Again, it looks very similar. We have a green control valve that we weren't using as effectively as we could for education. We hooked it up in a simple piping network that the students built, which is a valuable skill for them as operators. All half-inch threaded pipe. We put on 2 gate valves, and we have a globe valve. You can see the valves are a little bit different. They have different functions. Again, gate valves block, globe valves control. And then I turn this into a tool in GameMaker. And so you can see it's a similar picture. I took the pictures on a blue sheet for a reason, and that was so I could use chroma key to remove the background. And I'll show you a couple of things here. It has a little PID controller, which is a control system that controls the flow through this valve, and we can use that to our advantage when we're bypassing this control valve. So kind of neat. Jumping right into GameMaker. GameMaker is a neat tool, but it's not the easiest tool to use. And so I have a few pointers down here. Pros and cons. It is a good tool for a beginner, but probably not an absolute beginner. It requires a little familiarity with computers, a little familiarity with coding if you're going to make a little bit more sophisticated game like a simulation. On the upside, it is powerful enough for some good games in a simulation. In fact, many PC games and console games, like on an Xbox or a PlayStation, may be made with GameMaker. It's much easier than some real fancy tools like Blender or Unity that make the real fancy games. Although it's not too bad to learn, there's still plenty to learn. I got started by reading this game, The Game Maker's Apprentice. I figure it probably took me 15 hours to read through it at 300 pages. I only read maybe 20 pages an hour, 15 pages an hour. I probably spent about 40 hours building games in GameMaker. They walk you through building a lot of games in this book. And so I built about 5 of them per the book, maybe 40 hours, and then I spent a lot of time training. It's an interesting game, what I came up with, that game that I'll show you, and I'll give you a little demo of it in a minute. But kind of at a high level, some interesting facts to give you a feel about the complexity of a GameMaker simulation. Mine had 11 sprites, which are little animated objects in the game. I had 17 objects, which are little bits of code that control a sprite built into the game. I had 4 scripts, which are small snippets of code. It's in GML, which is GameMaker language. It's similar to C. I'm not much of a programmer, but I can cut and paste and hack my way through some code. My code totally, I had 4 blocks of code. One was 73 lines to calculate flow using authentic engineering principles, 20 lines for some global variables, 25 lines to draw the PID object, and 42 lines to perform the PID function in the controller. Surprisingly, I had 232 images in the game because, for example, I'll show you in a minute, when the valves open, every little bit open is another image, and so I took a lot of images, and I figured I probably spent about 23 hours making this game so far, and I still got quite a bit more work to do. That's all I have for this section. That is just a brief overview of the project. In the next segment, what I'll do is I'll walk you through the game, and then I'll have a brief section on walking you through a similar tool, a little less sophisticated in game blocks, and then we'll wrap it up with I guess it'll actually be a fourth video probably, on the pros and cons of GameMaker versus GameBlock, and the educational value of both. Thank you.